Well, good morning. Well, our breakfast briefing is very timely because today is President Nazarbayev's visit to the UK. It's the last day of his visit. I hope he will be productive in conducting talks with the government of the UK and with the British companies, and I wish him good luck in this endeavour. Our breakfast briefing will be as productive as his visit. So we'll start with a brief introduction about Kazakhstan, then we'll move into other different topics covering the country, and then we'll conclude with a few recommendations for you. So, a few facts about the country which you, of course, know. Well, it's one of the largest countries in the world, the 9th largest, and it's also the largest landlocked country with the total area of 2.7 million square kilometers. It has a very small population, though, of only 17.56 million people. And if you look at its density, it's even smaller, so it ranks 98th in the world. It has been independent since late 1991, but is currently ranked by the World Bank as an upper-middle income economy, with the GDP per capita of more than $12,000 this year. So, let's take a look at Kazakhstan in the international rankings. I've chosen a few international rankings for you here. As you can see, the country fares pretty well in terms of economic performance. For instance, the recent Doing Business rank of the World Bank placed it at number 41 in the world, which is very good, especially compared to last year when it was 53rd. It also has good reputation with the World Economic Forum's Competitive Index, for instance, or the Legato and Prosperity Index of last year, and also with the Index of Economic Freedom compiled by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and Wall Street Journal. But it fares a bit worse in terms of its political performance. For instance, you have here two rankings, one by Transparency International, the Corruption Perceptions Index of last year, and the World Press Freedom Index of Reporters Without Borders. So there is some progress to do on that front. Well, you know this country, first of all, for its tremendous oil and gas reserves. So the country currently ranks 12th in the world in terms of proven oil reserves, with 30 billion barrels of oil, and it ranks 19th in the world in terms of proven natural gas reserves, with 1.5 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. Well, it's just ahead of Libya and behind Egypt, and as for oil, it follows Nigeria and precedes Qatar. And it's also the second largest producer of oil and gas in the former Soviet Union behind Russia. Well, since independence, oil has powered Kazakhstan's growth and prosperity. You see from this slide that the GDP per capita increased between 91 and 2014, by more than a factor of 8 to $12,000 last year. At the same time, the share of people living at the national poverty line has decreased dramatically from more than 45% in the early 2000s to less than 5% in 2013, according to the national statistics. Well, perhaps Astana, the country's capital, is the best illustration of how profoundly the country has changed since becoming independent in the early 1990s. Here I have a few pictures of Astana as it was known in the Soviet times as Tselynograd. These are pictures taken in 1971, and be sure that not much changed between 71 and 91 when the country became independent. So these are the pictures from back then, and here is how Astana looks today. Well, it's a modern city, a global capital with skyscrapers, high-quality residential and office property, different monuments, green parks, and all the rest you can find in any global capital today. At the same time, Astana's population has grown dramatically by more than 300% since it became the capital of the country in 1997. The population was 275,000 people in 1997 when the capital moved from Almaty to Astana, and it's now more than 850,000 people, which makes Astana the third largest city in Kazakhstan behind Almaty and Shymkent, two cities in the south. The demography of the country and the city, the capital city, has also changed dramatically since Kazakhstan's independence. Here you have Astana's population in 1989 and 2012. As you can see, the share of Kazakhs living in Astana has grown from 17.7% to almost 73%, while the share of Russians has decreased from 54% to a bit more than 17%. And the share of other ethnicities has also decreased, for instance, Ukrainians, Germans, etc. And on the lowest side of the slide, I have the country's population between 1989 and 2015, where you can see that the decrease of the Russians has been significant, but not as significant as for the capital city, because it has gone down from 37%, only 21%, while the share of Kazakhs has increased from 39% to 66%. Now let's take a look at the impact of lower oil prices on Kazakhstan's economy. Well, oil accounts for about a quarter of Kazakhstan's GDP, about 60% of its exports, and 60% of total government revenue each year. This is the data from this year. At the same time, as we have seen, the price of Brent oil has fallen by more than 50% since the middle of 2014, reaching a low of $41.76 per barrel in late August. In this context, of course, this impact will be very negative on the country's oil production, which will fall this year and likely next year as well. This is Kazakhstan's total oil production in million tons per year. It was stable at around 80 million tons in the past 2 years, and next year, according to the forecast of the Energy Ministry, it will be between 73 and 80 million tons, depending on the price of oil. So if the price of oil stays at $50 per barrel, which is its current level, production will likely be about 80 million tons. If it falls to $40 per barrel, it will decrease to 77 million tons. And if it falls to $30 per barrel, for instance, if Iran starts to pour its cheap oil onto the market, it may fall to as low as 73 million tons, which is much lower than in all previous years. And here we have some statistics regarding the performance of Kazakhstan's major production company, which is owned by more than half by the government. This is Kazmunagas Exploration and Production, which produced 12.3 million tons of oil last year. As you can see, its net income has decreased from more than $1.5 billion in 2010 to less than $400 million in 2014. And its operating margin and return on capital employed have also suffered from the lower price of oil. Then you have, of course, the impact of the low price of oil on the national currency, the tenge, which has been under considerable pressure since last year because of both the declining price of oil and the ruble's volatility. You have two different lines here. The red line depicts the US dollar tenge exchange rate, and the purple one depicts the US dollar ruble exchange rate. Well, as you can see, in February 2014, the National Bank of Kazakhstan, the NBK, devalued the national currency, the tenge, by 20%. Then, in November that year, the Bank of Russia allowed the ruble to float in order to stop burning through its cash in a bid to support the ruble. And then the balance was actually destroyed between the tenge and the ruble vis-à-vis the dollar. And in this context, the National Bank of Kazakhstan in August 2015 decided to allow the tenge to float as well, shifting to a so-called policy of inflation targeting, because it had spent earlier more than $20 billion in trying to support the tenge from depreciation. But then, as the tenge started to depreciate dramatically, and as worries began to grow across the country that the economy would become unstable, the NBK intervened and resumed its open market operations in order to support the tenge again. So the exchange rate has somewhat stabilized since then, but it's still much different from what it was back in 2014, where the price of oil was high. Then you have, of course, the impact of these price dynamics on Kazakhstan's growth expectations. You can see from this slide that Kazakhstan's GDP growth rates have been going downward since the recent economic crisis of 2008-2009, and the expectation for this year is much lower than it was for the previous years, because we have two scenarios, in fact: the optimistic scenarios by Fitch Ratings and the IMF, who say that it will be around 1.8 2% in 2015. And you have the consensus scenario shared by the government of Kazakhstan itself, by the World Bank, by the EBRD, by Standard & Poor's and Moody's, who say that it will be around 1.5%, which is much lower than in 14, 13, and in the early middle 2000s when the prices of oil were very high and the country was expanding its oil production. But Kazakhstan has significant financial reserves to offset the negative oil shock. Well, as of today, it has more than $69 billion worth of National Oil Fund reserves. The National Oil Fund was established in 2000 to accumulate reserves and revenue from the oil and gas industry and to provide financial cushion in case of crisis. Then you also have the gross international reserves of the NBK, which stand at more than $28 billion. And the government also controls via the NBK the single pension fund, because all the pension funds, all the private pension funds were merged into a single pension fund in 2013, and they now have about $24.9 billion of reserves. And all that can be mobilized by the government, by the NBK, to offset the negative impact of the declining oil price. Well, the National Oil Fund will primarily serve to cover public deficits in the next 2 years. As you can see, the piece of the cheese which is separated from the rest, this is the share of the National Oil Fund in the country's budget. As you can see, the National Oil Fund will be increasingly responsible for covering the budget deficit in 15, 16, 17, and then only in 18, when the crisis is expected to end. Actually, the National Oil Fund will provide only 33.3% of the budget for the government to be able to operate normally as it did in the past years. So this is enormous financial support which has been given by the National Oil Fund and managed by the NBK. And then you have the NBK itself and the single pension fund, who will act as lenders of last resort to help the economy recover from its current situation. For instance, you had the Samruk-Kazyna Sovereign Wealth Fund, which actually bought 50% of Kazakhstan's stake in Kashagan from Kazmunaygas for $4.7 billion. And at the same time, the National Bank of Kazakhstan bought 10% plus one ordinary share of KMG, which is owned by Samruk-Kazyna, for $4 billion, which means a net transfer of funds from the NBK via Samruk-Kazyna to Kazmunaygas. And the NBK has also provided $2.7 billion to Samruk-Kazyna in exchange for its bonds, which is another way of supporting the Sovereign Wealth Fund and all its subsidiaries. And there will also be some funding from the single pension fund next year, which is still unclear to what extent it will be provided, but since they have close to $30 billion of reserves, they will likely help the real economy pull through the crisis in these times. Well, the top priority for all the government is, of course, avoiding social unrest and instability, as it happened in December 2011 in Zhanaozen in the country's west, where, as a result of clashes with riot police, 16 protesters were killed, according to the official government account, and more than 100 were left wounded. So this is the worst-case scenario which the government will try to avoid at any cost. And all these measures are actually aiming to stave off this kind of crisis. Now let's look at succession politics. Well, Kazakhstan is one of the only two post-Soviet countries that have been governed by the same president since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The other countries, of course, Uzbekistan. Nursultan Nazarbayev has been president since December 1991, and he was, of course, at the helm of the country in Soviet times when he was the party chief in Soviet Kazakhstan, so he has been in power for more than 30 years. He's also the second oldest president in the former Soviet Union. As you can see here, he's 75 this year. Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan is 77. And all the presidents of surrounding countries, including Vladimir Putin of Russia, are much younger. He's 63. They have three presidents from Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, who are less than 65 years old. Nazarbayev has three constitutional successors, according to Article 48.1. Well, the first successor is the Speaker of the Senate, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. The second in line is Kabibullah Jakupov, the Speaker of the Lower Chamber of Parliament, the Majlis. And the third one who has a legitimate claim to the presidency in case of a transition is the Prime Minister, Karim Asimov. Well, of course, keeping power in Kazakhstan is much harder than taking it because, well, it's a peculiar country which has its own Soviet heritage, its local heritage, and to become and remain president, you have to have a few factors combined, all at the same time. For instance, have the support of the ruling party, which dominates the parliament, have the support of police and armed forces, that is, the security apparatus, have the support of the business elites, including some local oligarchs, and have the support of regional clans, which have very much influence, for instance, in the country's west, where oil production is focused, where these clans can have much influence and, they can have a defining influence on the local course of events. Well, despite the 21st century veneer, tribal politics still lives on. Here we have a quote from a Kazakh historian, Nurbulat Masanov, who said in 1998 about the clans, "To this day, clanism is important. They're not the only prism for interpreting and classifying the social and political processes taking place in Kazakhstan. It is an important psychological factor which finds its greatest application in the selection and career paths of public officials. The clan factor underlies the legitimacy of an individual's claim to this or that public office, feeds his hopes, and determines his ability to play an independent role in political life. It is the clan factor that largely defines the extent of an official's authority, his power, how high he is likely to move in government service, the bounds of his social space, and the length of time he stays in power." This is quite topical today. Well, this is a map that gives you an idea of how the old Zhuz system worked. You know, there were 3 Zhuz in Kazakhstan, 3 historical areas dominated by specific tribes and clans. You had the senior Zhuz in the country's south, this is the red area. You had the middle Zhuz in the center, north, and east. And you have the junior Zhuz in the west, where much of oil production is concentrated. So you have these clans, these Zhuz divisions, and you have different sectors of the economy that are focused in every area. For instance, as I said, oil and gas production in the west. You have agriculture and mining on the territory of Middle Zhuz, and you have in the south, of course, a bit of agriculture, and I put a sign of a purse. This is the financial center of Almaty, which is actually the former capital, and one of the most important cities, which accounts for, I suppose, about 20% of the country's GDP, and is home to many international companies, banks, etc. Well, there are a few scenarios regarding the succession to Nazarbayev. The first scenario is the family scenario, in which the family inherits. Under this scenario, Nazarbayev's elder daughter, Dariga Nazarbayev, who has been deputy prime minister since September 2015, could become president and go, to the Akorda, to rule over the country. But already a few members of the presidential clan in power currently occupy various positions of varying influence. You have Nazarbayev's middle son-in-law, Timur Kulibayev, one of the country's richest persons, who is the president of Kazenergy. You have Nazarbayev's nephew, who is Akhmedjan Yasimov, the CEO of Astana Expo 2017, which will manage, in fact, the Expo event in 2 years. You have Nazarbayev's grandson, Nurali Aliyev, who is deputy mayor of Astana. And you have Nazarbayev's nephew, Samat Abish, who is the deputy director of the National Security Committee, which is a very important position, of course. The other scenario is the inner circle takes over. Well, the inner circle is those people who run Nazarbayev, managing his personal affairs, having his ear and advising him on crucial political and economic issues. Have, for instance, the Prime Minister, Masimov, the Mayor of Astana, Jaksibekov, the head of the presidential administration, who has direct access to the president every day. Nurlan Nigmatulin, have the director of the National Security Committee, the KNB, Nurtai Abikayev, have the Minister of Defense, Imangul Jismagambetov, who, by the way, hails from the junior Zhuz in the west and has much influence on the oil-producing provinces of Kazakhstan. But there is no certainty as to who will, if this scenario plays out, become the new president, because I suppose Nazarbayev hasn't made up his mind yet on the future succession, so you have to analyze all those persons' moves and rotations in order to understand how they are positioned against their potential rivals. And they have also the Turkmenistan scenario. You remember the very eccentric president of Turkmenistan, Sapar Murat Niyazov, was president between 1991 and 2006. also known as Turkmenbashi, or the father of the Turkmen. And he was succeeded upon his death in 2006 by his health minister and deputy prime minister, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, who has been president ever since. Well, this is kind of a dark horse scenario. Well, what is surprising about this? Berdimuhamedov actually used to be Niyazov's personal dentist for many years and had direct access to the president, so he could influence his decisions, he could know his mind, read his mind. And so that's one of the explanations why he emerged from nowhere and became the new president, while there were other contenders, including the constitutional ones, for instance, the chairman of parliament, who was in fact arrested and some falsified, they say, charges, and was removed from the succession line in favor of Berdimuhamedov. So this scenario is also can also play out. Well, all that is to say that predicting the succession is like betting on horse racing. You never know for sure who will come first, but good analysis will help gauge the contenders' realistic chances. This is very important because if you follow the politics and if you follow each potential contender's moves, you can understand, at least for the time being, who is in favor, who is out of favor, and what can happen and how. Either way, the good thing about that is that legitimacy will be the key concern, both from the top down and from the bottom up. The bottom up, that means that a new president has to be accepted by the population. There has to be some kind of consensus about the new president. The top down means that since Kazakhstan is very much concerned about its image and reputation, it will strive to do anything it can to make sure that the new president is recognized by the international community, is deemed legitimate, constitutional, the legal claimant to the highest political office. So this is the good thing. They care about their reputation. Now let's discuss internal security and stability. Well, Kazakhstan was considered as Central Asia's island of peace and stability for most of the 1990s and 2000s. Well, there are a few factors that explained this image of Kazakhstan. First, religious tolerance. Then, no history of local extremism. In fact, there were no known incidents related to local extremism. Relatively high living standards, especially compared to neighboring countries, much poorer states such as Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and of course political stability ensured in large part by President Nazarbayev's very strong rule and his ability to balance the interests of various clans and to manage their aspirations. But this myth was brutally shattered in 2011 and 12 when there were a few incidents, security incidents. Well, this is the map that gives you an idea where those incidents took place in those 2 years. Well, the first one was in May 2011 in Aktobe, the country's northwest. While other incidents followed in October of that year, in November in Atirau, the oil capital of the country, and Taraz in the south. Then there was a carnage in August 12 in a national park near Almaty, where there were more than, I think, 12 people killed by extremists. And then in September that year, again in Atirau. Well, the map also shows different extremist groups that operate across Central Asia, such as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Hizb ut-Tahrir in Kyrgyzstan. You have a few other organizations such as Jamaat Jundullah in Tajikistan, and of course you have Afghanistan further to the south with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other organizations. Well, during those 2 years, more than 50 people, including the extremists themselves, were killed or died otherwise in terrorist attacks across the country. There were 27 casualties on the part of the extremists, 14 civilians dead, 9 police officers, special forces dead, and 8 more wounded. So this was a huge shock. But in fact, the list of banned extremist organizations has been expanding continuously since 2004, with the first editions such as Al-Qaeda, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, of the Kurdish National Congress. And the last edition was last year. This is Al-Takfir wal-Hijra, an extremist organization based in the Middle East. So you have all those organizations banned across the country by the local judiciary system, and this reflects the true concern of the government. Ironically, Islamic State has not been banned yet, but it's considered a very serious threat. Well, last November, the Islamic State released a video featuring radicalized Kazakh children during military training in Syria. And here are they. And according to the KNB, there are around 100 Kazakhs fighting today with Islamic State in Syria. This is the official estimate, which can be lower or higher. Nobody is sure of how many exactly are staying there and fighting with the Islamic State. But this is the estimation of the KNB. So in order to counter all those threats, and in the wake of those attacks we just saw, a new anti-terrorism structure took shape in mid-2013 with the creation, under the leadership of the National Security Committee's chairman, Nurtayev Bakiyev, who is Nazarbayev's closest advisor, of a new anti-terrorism structure, the Anti-Terrorism Center, which comprises today the Deputy Director of the KNB, the Director of Foreign Intelligence, 12 ministers, well, all the ministers in the cabinet, the head of the President's Security Detail, the chairs of the Anti-Corruption Agency, the Religious Affairs Committee and the Statistics Committee, and there are also 14 provincial anti-terrorism commissions chaired by their respective governors, and there are 2 more in the cities of Astana and Almaty which have a special status in the country. Furthermore, a 5-year anti-terrorism plan was approved in September 2013 in order to respond to all those terrorist threats. Well, this plan provides for more than $660 million US dollars worth of funding, both from the central government and from the regional governments. And you see here the allocation of funds throughout the years up to 2017, with most of the funding falling on 2015, that is on this year. And then the funding will progressively diminish as the country modernizes its security apparatus by giving it more sophisticated weapons, more efficient training, etc. So all that money is to serve the good cause. Fighting violent extremism is, of course, a top priority for the Kazakh government. And there are several factors that are very unsettling today and which are mutually reinforcing. You have, of course, corruption, which is a problem everywhere in each country, and especially in the former Soviet Union countries. The government is taking steps to fight it, but, well, as in any other country, these steps have yet to show their efficiency. You have income inequality growing, especially because of the economic situation today. You have radical propaganda, with all those organizations banned or not banned yet, which are promoting their agenda locally. You have the lack of political reform, and we'll speak about that a bit later. And have, of course, the economic slowdown, which is the major cause for concern. And all that is a problem and may lead to more extremism, which the government wants to prevent from happening. Now let's take a look at the new great game and regional geopolitics. Well, in July 1997, Strobe Talbot, who is now the chairman of the Brookings Institution in Washington, who was US Deputy Secretary of State, said during a speech at the Johns Hopkins University, "For the last several years, it has been fashionable to proclaim, or at least to predict, a replay of the great game in the Caucasus and Central Asia. The implication, of course, is that the driving dynamic of the region, fueled and lubricated by oil, will be the competition of the great powers to the disadvantage of the people who live there. Our goal is to avoid it and actively to discourage the atavistic outcome. In pondering and practicing the geopolitics of oil, let's make sure that we are thinking in terms of appropriate to the 21st century and not the 19th. We want to see all responsible players in the Caucasus and Central Asia be winners." Well, in fact, the new great game is a reference to the historical great game which was played between Russia and Great Britain in South Asia, with the final ultimate goal being access to India via Afghanistan. And the new great game is a replay with many more players involved and with stakes being considerably high because of globalization and all the other factors that are characteristic of today's geopolitics. But this new great game, despite what Strobe Talbot promised, did happen, in fact, because here you see only one aspect of it, but a crucial one. This is the battle for access to oil, Kazakhstan's oil. We have 3 major consortia operating in the country, Kazakhstan's 3 major oil deposits, which account for more than 80–90% of all proven oil reserves, Tengiz, Kashagan, and Karachaganak. And have 3 consortia that operate in Chevroil, Karachaganak Petroleum Operating, and the North Caspian Operating Company Consortium. And you see that the number of players is increasing over the time. So, for instance, in Tengiz, we have only three countries involved, the US, Russia, and Kazakhstan itself. On Karachaganak, there are 5 countries involved: the US, the UK, Italy, Russia, and Kazakhstan. And the NCOC is, well, the largest consortium in terms of the number of shareholders, which are, we have all of them here, well, yeah, which are 7. Well, the United States, the UK, Italy, France, Kazakhstan, Japan, and since September 2013, China as well, via CNPC. Well, there is a very fashionable theory, which was authored by a famous British geographer, Sir Halford Mackinder, member of the Royal Geographical Society, the theory of the heartland. Well, in one of his articles and later works, Mackinder said that who controls the heartland, which is the area at the heart of Eurasia, controls the world island, which is actually Eurasia. And who controls the world island controls the world. So I put a red cross on where Kazakhstan is to show you that, well, Mackinder was not thinking about Kazakhstan specifically, because this country didn't exist as an independent state. He was actually referring to that area on the map. So even if this is just a metaphor for many, this shows the importance of the country in the collective imagination and the imagination of those who are in the country working to have access to its resources, working to lobby for the interests on behalf of their respective governments or companies. So this is quite interesting to see. Well, in order to respond to all of that, Kazakhstan has elaborated a so-called multi-vector foreign policy. You can see different vectors looking in different directions. Well, the purpose of this is a policy which is dear to Nazarbayev personally because he's the author, implies that Kazakhstan will develop good relations with every neighbor, well, first of all, Russia and China, and then countries of Central Asia. And then, of course, it will look much farther on the map, opening up to the West, looking to strengthen ties with Middle East, South Asia, and even countries as far away as Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, etc. This is a policy of open borders and good relations with everybody. But Kazakhstan has had historically to manage a very delicate balance between 2 of its neighbors, which are the most powerful ones, Russia and China. And there was in Kazakhstan history a Khan, who was the ruler of the Middle Jews, Ablai Khan, who was, by the way, featured on a 100 tenge banknote in the 1990s, or the old banknote, who ruled in 1771, 1781, and was very famous because of his policy of delicate balancing between Russia and China, because he had alliances with both countries. He sent gifts and relatives as hostages to both the Russian Tsar and the Chinese Emperor. And so by doing so, he managed to ensure that Kazakhstan was stable, it was free from external threats, and that neither country was willing to take it under its exclusive control, so which allowed it to be relatively independent and autonomous in those years. Well, since 2010, Kazakhstan has been drifting into Russia's orbit because of the so-called Eurasian integration. Well, first of all, in July 2010, there was the customs union of 3 countries, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, which was established to promote cross-border trade investments. And it was actually morphed into a wider structure with more scope for improvement and action, which is the Eurasian Economic Union. It took effect on the 1st of January 2015, among those 3 states, and there were 2 new additions, Armenia the following day, and Kyrgyzstan, which joined formally in August 2015. So there are now 5 countries of this Eurasian Economic Union, a very huge area covered by its member states, and, as they say, big potential. But so far, the results have been a bit disappointing. Well, you can look at these statistics. These are Kazakhstan's total trade, exports, and to and imports from the customs union. Well, the rest of the customs union as it used to be before the Eurasian Union took over. That is with Russia and Belarus. As you can see, trade grew a bit between 11 and 13. Then it dropped because of the economic recession in Russia and the impact of the low price of oil. But if you look at the exports and imports separately, you can see that imports into Kazakhstan were growing more rapidly than its imports were growing into the rest of the customs union, which was a huge point of contention in Kazakhstan because, well, President has promised shared prosperity. Many people saw this as Russia's geopolitics playing out, Russia's trying to take the country under its control and to supply cheap goods to disadvantage of local producers. Well, the current situation is a bit confused because of the crisis in Russia, we cannot understand what will happen next. But as you see, imports dropped a bit and exports increased. Now, China is an increasingly important partner alongside Russia. Here you have the total trade with China in $1 billion. China is, according to Kazakhstan sources, the second largest trade partner. According to China, it is the first largest partner because some part of the trade is not accounted for by the customs authority. So there's a big problem of taking stock of all the goods that cross the border. But anyway, if we trust the Kazakh statistic, we see that China's trade with Kazakhstan has been expanded as well. And because of the crisis in 2014, it has tumbled, and this is true both for exports, specifically for exports, because Kazakhstan exports its exports are composed mostly of oil and gas to China via two major pipelines. And imports from China have also decreased. At the same time, China is one of the top 3 foreign lenders behind the Netherlands and the UK, with a share of 10.2% of the total debt owed by Kazakhstan to the rest of the world, which represents about $16 billion. And despite the recent turmoil in China, on its own stock market, the crisis in Kazakhstan because of the low price of oil, China has been moving aggressively ahead with its Silk Road Initiative, New Silk Road Initiative. And you see here on the right side of the screen, recent Chinese investment commitments since December 2014. Well, there were a few visits by the Chinese Premier to Astana, by the Prime Minister of Kazakhstan to China in April, and by the President Nazarbayev to China in September. And on all these occasions, there were agreements signed with promises made by China to invest into Kazakhstan's economy. And these figures are really impressive, especially given the size of Kazakhstan as a country, as a market. In comparison, Russia's investment commitments during the same period were $0, because Russia doesn't want to invest, because it has own problems to manage domestically. Well, this is a huge contrast. We have the Eurasian Economic Union, a formal structure, and we have no formal structure with China, but have real things being done on China's initiative and with China's funding. At the same time, the West remains a very important investor in Kazakhstan. These are the data which depict total volume of FDI in Kazakhstan between 2005 and 2015, according to the NBK. And as you can see, there are 5 countries featured here: the Netherlands, the United States of America, Switzerland, France, and the UK, which account for the bulk of FDIs in Kazakhstan during this period. I also have, of course, China and Russia, with Russia coming last on this list. So the importance of the West as an investor cannot be explained better than by looking at those figures. Now let's take a look at the final section, the most important one, I think, which is political and economic reforms and investment opportunities in Kazakhstan, given all that I already told you. Well, political reforms are really overdue. You know, Nazarbayev has been there for 30 years, 25 years, but the future political succession, whatever the scenario, will likely accelerate these reforms, and the most plausible outcome is that the presidency will be progressively weakened in favor of the other branches of government and the other branches of Kazakhstan's power, the government itself, with the prime minister likely assuming more powers and becoming more autonomous, with both chambers of parliament, the Majlis and the Senate, being given real authority and real legislative initiative, and the courts. This is all in the future. But as I said, since there will be no man like Nazarbayev, because he's been a historic figure, who has done a lot and who cannot be replicated, there will be likely a reform that will rebalance the system, which is a good thing, of course, unless it leads to instability, as we saw in Kyrgyzstan, for instance. Well, there have been no ambitious political reforms, but there have been a few economic reforms that are really ambitious. First of all, the investment legislation of Kazakhstan has been overhauled since last year. There were a few laws adopted last year, approved by Nazarbayev, that create the category of so-called priority investment projects, which are more than $20 million, and they have special conditions attached to them. For instance, they have 0 corporate income tax and land tax for 10 years, 0 property tax for 8 years, a 30% investment subsidy on eligible projects when the government gives you the money when the project has been carried out to offset some of your costs. National monopoly tariffs are capped for 5 years and beyond, which guarantees stability and more visibility in the short and medium term. There is a possibility to employ foreign workforce quota-free for specific projects. And the Investment and Development Ministry, which is chaired by Asad Isakeshev, another of Nazarbayev's close advisors on economy issues, has become a one-stop shop for investors. So it manages all the paperwork and all the procedures, and Isakeshev himself has been designated as investment ombudsman, so the man who protects both domestic and foreign investors from any kind of trouble they may encounter in their dealings in Kazakhstan, be it harassment from the tax authorities or any other trouble. Then there is, of course, the WTO accession, which is a major topic. The country applied for membership in 1996. So it took many years for this membership to be approved, and in July this year, the WTO General Council approved finally the accession terms of Kazakhstan, and the country is headed for accession by the end of this year. So what will this bring about? Well, according to the agreement which was reached by the two sides, tariff rates for all products will be bound on average at 6.1%, including 7.6% for agricultural goods, where there will be specific commitments undertaken in the telecom, insurance, banking, transport, tourism and distribution sectors. For instance, the establishment of branches by foreign companies directly under 5 years. There is also a pledge by Kazakhstan to accede upon the finalization of its membership talks to the Information Technology Agreement to facilitate relations in the IT area. There is also a commitment on trade-related investment measures, which is important specifically for the oil and gas sector because, you know, a very hard point for many companies working in Kazakhstan, which is local content. And these provisions will be scrapped by 2021 in all contracts. Of course, if these provisions are already in the contracts that have been signed in the past, they will be implemented. But the new contracts will be free from these provisions, which in many ways limited the foreign companies' freedom for maneuvering. And then we have the government procurement agreement, the GPA, which will be implemented by 2020. And we have trade-related and intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, which will be acceded to upon implementation of the whole package, and which will provide, of course, a high level of protection of intellectual property rights in the country, which is in all the former Soviet countries a major problem, because there is a little oversight and little enforcement. Then there is a very ambitious project, which I think was broached by Nazarbayev yesterday or today, which is the Astana International Financial Center, which will be established by next year. The Majlis recently approved the draft law, which outlines its general scheme, and it will become fully operational by 2018. And this AIFC, in fact, aims to replicate the success story of the Dubai International Financial Center, the DIFC, which is one of the world's global financial hubs, and it will operate in conjunction with the regional financial center of Almaty, which already exists in the former capital. So what will be the characteristics of these AIFC? Zero or reduced tax rates for up to 50 years, these exemptions for up to 5 years, both for those who work at the center and their family members, English law and international best practices. In fact, all the decisions made by this new center will be made in English, and all the hearings will be held only in English, with perhaps a few translations available in Russian and Kazakh for those who don't speak English. And the decisions will be based on English commercial law. The possibility to employ, again, quota-free foreign workforce for this center specifically. And there will be an independent investment court or a financial court, which will be staffed almost entirely by foreign judges and lawyers who have much expertise in similar issues, have worked in Dubai as well, in other global financial hubs, and who will share their expertise and experience and will ensure the highest level of standards for this center, for this future financial center. In order to enable its functioning, the government has already promised, this was written in the press, to link Astana by air to 12 global financial hubs by 2019. There are already connections with 7 destinations across the world, in Europe and Asia. There are direct flights from Astana to London, Paris, Frankfurt, Moscow, Istanbul, Beijing and Seoul. And there will be more direct flights to such places as New York, Dubai, of course, Singapore, Hong Kong and Tokyo. There are currently 458 international flights per week to and from Kazakhstan, including 65 flights per day. There were 13 new flights, international flights added last year, 7 new international flights added so far this year. There will be more, so there will be ample opportunity for foreign investors to travel to the country directly from where they live and to conclude their deals locally. And there is, of course, a lot of opportunity stemming from the fact that the government has decided to carry out massive privatizations of state-owned enterprises, and they offer unprecedented opportunities for both domestic and foreign investors. There are currently about 60 companies for sale, including 38 subsidiaries of Samruk Kazina, the sovereign wealth fund, 4 subsidiaries for both Baytarek and Kazagro holdings, or the Baytarek, the financial holding, and Kazagro, which manages the agricultural sector, and 14 government entities, government-owned entities, which are owned directly by the Ministry of Finance on behalf of the government, and will be privatized very shortly via initial public offerings, secondary public offerings, or via auctions. The government also intends to decrease state participation in the economy from 50% today to about 15%, a very ambitious target by 2020. And in doing so, it will follow the so-called Yellow Pages rule, which was first elaborated in Singapore, and which says that state participation should be decreased, in some cases down to zero, in areas where the private sector can deliver more efficiently and more productively. So this is the government's current ideology. We're going to let investors, private investors in order to let them do their job, which they can do better than us. There are already very considerable visa exemptions that will stimulate the investor appetite even more, because under the current legislation, until January 2018, the citizens of 19 countries, including, there are many European countries, countries from the Middle East, countries from Asia, most of them developed countries, of course, they can travel to Kazakhstan without a visa for up to 15 days. And in certain cases, this period can be extended for another 30 days if they have an invitation from a Kazakh company or from a joint venture, local joint venture, which has a project, which has a contract for them to sign, for instance, that the people can come and work and stay longer as consultants or in any other capacity, which is a very good thing. Well, compared especially to Russia, which is in a case of self-isolation, this is a very huge difference. And this shows the seriousness of the government and its willingness to open up to the rest of the world. While the oil, gas and mining sectors, which are the key sectors of the economy, are being profoundly transformed. Since last year, access to subsoil resources has become much easier and quicker because they have introduced the so-called Australian method, which allows companies to bid for various deposits, most of the time very small ones, where there is little certainty that there are commercially attractive resources, but which are still worth exploring. And so these companies can obtain permits in a very short period of time. And the government has put up for licensing about 100 deposits, which are now up for grabs for investors, domestic investors alike. There has been ongoing regulatory simplification since last year, which means practically 98% less overlap in model contracts, 60% fewer permits to obtain. This is because, by the way, the World Bank has improved Kazakhstan's position in the doing business ranking because of all those improvements, which reduce the time needed to obtain a permit, to obtain access to resources, water, electricity, to obtain access to government documentation on resources, for instance. And there will, by the way, a database of the investment ministry and I think the World Bank, which will cover all the deposits in Kazakhstan and will provide free of charge information to investors willing to invest and exploit them. And there will be a new subsoil code next year, which will offer an even higher level of protection to investors. And the contract signing time period will be reduced to just 3 days from 25 days today. And by the way, before last year's reforms, it was about 18 months, the time needed to sign a contract. Well, it all depended on individual cases, of course, but this is what the government wants to do, reduce to 3 days only. Of course, there is huge potential as well in all non-energy sectors of the Kazakh economy, because diversification is a major concern, especially today, with the oil price declining or staying low compared to the previous years. And in fact, the diversification is just beginning, because the government has done something in the past, but it's now doing much more and willing to do much more today. There are opportunities in every other sector than oil and gas. For instance, in the IT sector, in pharmaceuticals, in agriculture, with more room for intensive farming, for instance, telecoms, chemical engineering, because there are 3 refineries in Kazakhstan, but the country doesn't have enough capacity to provide enough petrol to its domestic market. So there is a plan for a 4th refinery, and this is a chance for investors to step in and do something good. And, of course, transport, given Kazakhstan's unique position as a bridge between Europe and Asia, and a huge potential in terms of linking the 2 parts of the Eurasian landmass. The investors don't need to go very far to find the right people for their key local positions, because Kazakhstan has a population that is well educated. Well, first of all, the Soviet standard of education, secondary and higher, was very high. There were professors coming down from Moscow to teach, so there is no doubt on that. There is a program financed by the government and created by Nazarbayev himself, the Voloshin program, which has enabled more than 11,000 Kazakhs to train at the world's best universities, including Cambridge and Oxford, for instance, since 1993, the date of its creation. And some Kazakh universities use British teaching standards and even employ in their senior positions the UK personnel, persons from other European countries and the US. For instance, the Kazakh British Technical University in Almaty, which supplies qualified managers and workers to the oil and gas industry. The Nazarbayev University, established a few years ago in Astana, which bears the name of the president. And, for instance, the KIMAP, the Institute of Management, in Almaty as well, which is run, I think, by their South Korean dean and many foreign staff working there, and ensuring that the education is good quality. And now, let's conclude. Well, Kazakhstan is a good place to invest because it is strong enough to weather the current crisis because of its financial reserves and the government's resolve to move forward with reforms. Political succession is not only a risk, it is also an opportunity, a generational change, and all the rest it implies, all the reforms that may become a reality after Nazarbayev's departure from power, which will one day happen. Doing business in Kazakhstan is safer than, for instance, Russia, Turkey, and Egypt. Despite all that we saw regarding security and stability, it's a very safe country today. It's not targeted specifically by extremists, by Al-Qaeda, by the Islamic State. There are people fighting abroad, yes, but the people from France, the UK fighting abroad as well. So this country is quite safe for business. It will continue to care for the interests of foreign investors, and we saw that via all those reforms that have been initiated or will be initiated soon. And there are plenty of opportunities for business in both energy and non-energy sectors, as we saw, with the diversification program just beginning to bear its first fruit and beginning to show the real direction the government wants to take on this. So there are opportunities lying ahead for both domestic and foreign investors. And, of course, we are welcome to unlock the potential of Kazakhstan and the rest of the former Soviet Union with Menas Associates top-quality specialist help, because we speak the local languages, which is a basic requirement, of course. We understand the local mentality, the way people think and operate in their minds. We have access to the right people on the ground in Kazakhstan and other countries of the former USSR. We think big and long-term. We know what you need to know, and we see what's hidden behind the curtains. And all of that is a guarantee of your success, of course. Then I will hand over to Charles.